In the summer of 1944, the Army was producing second lieutenants at Fort Benning, Georgia, faster than any officer training program in American history. The Infantry Officer Candidate School was running class after class through a 13-week course. The curriculum was compressed, the pace was relentless, and the output was a stream of brand new officers. The Army would come to call 90-day wonders, men who arrived in the European theater carrying gold bars on their collars and a gap in their training that no classroom could truly close. The men who had come before them, the ones already fighting in the hedgerows of Normandy, had a name for these arrivals: 90-day wonders. It was not a compliment. Through the Normandy campaign, infantry soldiers were absorbing a wildly disproportionate share of American losses. By the time the hedgerow battle reached its peak, roughly 90% of all American casualties in the theater were infantrymen. Army studies found that rifle companies in some divisions lost nearly 60% of their enlisted men and more than 68% of their officers between June 6th and July 31st, 1944. The rifle companies of a full-strength American infantry division comprised roughly 5,200 men out of a total divisional strength of more than 14,000. A fraction of the force, but a fraction bearing almost the entire weight of the fighting. And at the top of that funnel stood the rifle platoon leader. His job was to lead from the front. That meant he was always visible to the enemy. It meant he was always in the most dangerous position. And it meant that the Army needed to replace him faster than almost any other officer in the service. One Army assessment drawn from the later campaigns in Europe found that an average infantry regiment, in 3 months of combat, sustained 100% casualties, killed, wounded, or missing. The men who led those regiment's platoons were living inside that same arithmetic. One veteran officer put it plainly: most platoon leaders arrived green as grass and were too often still green when they were carried off to the field hospital or went feet first to graves registration. That was what it meant to be a rifle platoon leader in the ETO, Fort Benning, Georgia, the infantry school. By 1944, it had become one of the most productive military institutions in the history of the American Army, producing more officers than any establishment of its kind at a pace that matched the demand only because the demand itself was catastrophic. Between July 1941 and the end of the war, more than 100,000 candidates enrolled in Infantry Officer Candidate School. Roughly 2/3 completed the course and earned their commissions. The course ran 13 weeks, the origin of the nickname 90-Day Wonder. It covered tactics, weapons, map reading, leadership, small unit operations, everything a platoon leader needed to know at the speed a wartime army could teach it. But really, the truth was harsher than that. What it could not teach in 90 days was judgment. The instinct that tells a man when to push forward and when to hold. The knowledge of terrain that only comes from having used it under fire. The authority that comes not from rank, but from having been tested in front of the men you lead. Those things take time. And time was exactly what the replacement pipeline could not provide. The men arriving from Fort Benning were typically in their early 20s. Some were younger. They had been soldiers for months, not years. They knew the field manuals. They had practiced fire and maneuver on training grounds in Georgia. But they had not, in most cases, heard incoming artillery. They had not managed a casualty. They had not made a decision with lives on the line. They received their gold bars. They were handed their platoon assignments. Then they were sent to Europe. And on the other end, the system waiting for them was the individual replacement system, a system historians and veterans alike later identified as one of the most damaging logistical choices of the American war effort. Rather than keeping units together, training together, building the trust that unit cohesion creates, the replacement system funneled individual soldiers into slots vacated by casualties. A new lieutenant arrived at a company that had already lost its last platoon leader. The survivors of his platoon, the men who had watched the previous lieutenant get killed, or the one before him, sized up the new arrival with the particular skepticism of men who had already seen what fresh lieutenants could cost. Here was the reality a new rifle platoon leader stepped into. His platoon was 41 men, organized into 3 rifle squads and a headquarters section, armed with M1 Garands, Browning automatic rifles, carbines, and light machine guns. Led, in theory, by him, but in practice, led in every practical sense by his platoon sergeant. The platoon sergeant was a technical sergeant, the equivalent of what would later be called a sergeant first class. He was the second in command. He was the institutional memory. And usually, he was the most experienced combat soldier in the platoon. He knew the men by name, by habit, by temperament. He knew which squad leader could be trusted to act without orders and which one needed precise direction. He knew the personalities of the company commander and the first sergeant. He knew where the good ground was when you needed to dig in, how to read a tree line, how long it took to get ammunition resupply forward. The 90-day wonder knew the platoon sergeant outranked him in everything except official authority. And that was the first hell of being a rifle platoon leader. Arriving in a position of formal authority over men who knew more than you did in every way that mattered, and knowing that they knew it. The platoon sergeant, who had been through North Africa and Sicily and Normandy, was not going to be openly disrespectful. He was too professional for that. But he was going to watch, and the men were going to watch him watch. And in those first days and weeks, everything the new lieutenant did was being evaluated, not just by the enemy, but by his own platoon, measuring whether the man with the gold bars was going to get them killed or keep them alive. A platoon sergeant, by the D-Day Ohio Project account, was usually a few steps ahead of the platoon leader because of longer experience. He knew the men a lot better because he had been with them. The report noted, without much comfort, that most platoon leaders did not have enough luck to find time to develop skills. They arrived green, and were too often still green when they became casualties. Some lieutenants understood this from the first moment. They listened, they watched the sergeant, they learned the platoon before they tried to lead it. Those men had a better chance of surviving. Others arrived with the confidence Fort Benning had given them, and mistook knowledge of tactics for the wisdom of command. And really, that mistake could be fatal. Those men often did not last long enough to correct it. The doctrine was explicit, and the culture enforced it. An infantry platoon leader led from the front. This was not a metaphor. In an assault, the lieutenant was expected to be among the first to move. When the platoon crossed an open field under fire, he crossed with it. When the scouts reached a road intersection that might be covered by a German machine gun, the lieutenant was close behind them. Close enough to control what happened next. Close enough to be hit if the machine gun opened up. The reasoning was sound. A platoon moves toward where its leader is. If the leader stays back, the platoon hesitates. If the leader is forward, the platoon follows. The 36 to 41 men of a rifle platoon in the ETO were not going to advance into a defended position because someone at the rear shouted at them. They advanced because the man with the rank and the responsibility was already moving. But the reality is, the cost of that logic was brutal. The man with the rank and the responsibility was always where the fire was heaviest. He was also, in every practical sense, the most visible man in his element. Not because of the gold bars. Those were not visible past 50 yards. But because of what command looked like in the field. An officer checking a map. An officer giving hand signals at a road junction. An officer kneeling beside a casualty while the rest of the platoon stayed in the ditch. These were target behaviors. And every experienced German rifleman and sniper in the ETO had learned to read them. A rifle platoon leader in France or Germany carried a carbine, smaller and lighter than the M1 Garand the enlisted men carried, because the lieutenant was supposed to be directing fire, not simply providing it. He stood out, Officers in the German army had learned long before to dress like their men, carry their weapons, and avoid obvious command gestures in the open. The American army in 1944 had not fully absorbed that lesson. German snipers had. A lieutenant giving hand signals at the head of a column was a priority target. A man consulting a map while his platoon was halted was a priority target. The gold bars were invisible at range, but the behavior of command was not. The Hürtgen Forest, the Bocage of Normandy, the Siegfried Line, the Ardennes. In every environment where American infantry fought the German army in sustained ground combat, the rifle platoon leader stood at the point where violence was most concentrated. The statistics that followed were not surprising, but really, they were devastating. Roughly 9 out of 10 American casualties in the theater were infantrymen, a fraction of the force absorbing nearly all of it. And at the front of that fraction, leading each platoon into each objective, was a lieutenant who had been in uniform for less than a year. Here is what a rifle platoon leader in the ETO carried that the Army's records did not capture. He was responsible for 41 men, not 41 positions on an organizational chart. 41 people with families, with names, with hometowns he had learned in the first weeks and would remember for the rest of his life. When one of them was killed, the lieutenant wrote the letter. Not always, and not officially. That obligation belonged to the company commander. But in the closed world of a rifle platoon, it was the lieutenant who had been closest to what happened. Sometimes the letter was straightforward. Sometimes he spent hours trying to find words for something that could not be framed in the language the Army used for such things. The dead man had known the lieutenant for 3 weeks. The lieutenant would carry the name for the rest of his life, and that burden had to be carried in silence. He could not share that weight openly. An officer who showed doubt in front of his men undermined the authority that kept them moving. An officer who showed fear gave them no reason to follow him forward. The particular hell of command at platoon level was that the psychological weight had to be carried silently while maintaining the performance of confidence in front of men who would read every signal and draw conclusions about whether the next attack was survivable. The Army had no framework for this. The 90-day curriculum at Fort Benning taught tactics. It did not teach a 22-year-old how to decide who lives and who dies. It did not teach him how to keep making decisions after the first time he got that wrong. And still, replacements continued to arrive. The ones who lasted learned. The ones who learned developed. Sometimes within weeks, they gained the combat intuition that could not be taught in Georgia. The feel for terrain, the instinct for when German fire was truly covering a position and when it was not. The authority that comes not from rank, but from demonstrated competence. Some of them became very good at the job. But the Army kept no records of how long that took, because the Army did not measure what it cost. What it cost was this: a young man, placed in authority over other men, responsible for their lives, trained barely well enough to understand his own limitations, and required by his role to be where the killing was happening, again and again, for as long as he lasted, until the mathematics caught him, or until the war ended. Some survived. Some came home and did not talk about it, because the people waiting for them had no framework for what they were hearing, and because the only men who truly would have understood were the men who had been in the platoon with them. Many of those men were already buried in France. The rifle companies of an American infantry division in the ETO were not the largest element of the force. They were the sharpest point of it, the fraction of the Army that actually closed with the German Army and fought it hand to hand, hedgerow to hedgerow, house to house. And at the front of each of those rifle company platoons was a lieutenant. He was young. He was undertrained for the specific task he had been given. He was leading men who knew more than he did, and they were watching him to see what he would do with that authority. He was required by doctrine, by culture, and by military necessity to be where the fire was heaviest, because that was where a platoon leader had to be if the platoon was going to go there. But really, That was the cruel arithmetic of the position. Always forward, always visible, always first. From the first day he arrived, the mathematics worked against him. And the ones who survived the whole campaign came home changed by something that has no real name in the Army's official records. They had spent months making decisions that cost lives. They had carried that weight without being able to put it down. They had learned a job in the only school where the curriculum was designed by the enemy. The gold bars were worth the same whether you wore them for a week or for a year. But the truth is, everything underneath them changed completely. Some of these men learned fast enough to stay alive. They learned when to trust the platoon sergeant's instincts. They learned when a hedgerow concealed nothing and when it concealed death. They learned what artillery sounded like when it was searching and what it sounded like when it had found the range. They learned how to move men through open ground, how to judge a tree line, how to recognize the feel of a position that was about to erupt under German fire. Those lessons did not come from field manuals. They came from survival. And survival, really, was never guaranteed. A rifle platoon leader in the European theater did not have the luxury of gradual development. He was not given years to mature into command. He was handed 41 men, a mission, a front line, and a war already in progress. He entered a platoon with its own dead, its own scars, its own quiet judgments. The men had already seen lieutenants arrive. They had already seen some of them fail. They had already seen others die before they had time to understand the names of the soldiers they were leading. That is what made the position so merciless. The lieutenant was expected to inspire confidence before he had earned it. He was expected to make correct decisions before he had enough experience to know why one choice led to survival and another led to disaster. He was expected to stand at the point where fear, responsibility, and violence met, and then act as though all of it were normal. But nothing about it was normal. He was barely old enough to understand himself, and yet he was expected to carry the lives of dozens of other men. He was expected to keep moving after the first man died, after the second, after the first letter home. After the first time he realized in the privacy of his own thoughts that a choice he made had ended a life that might have been spared. The Army had procedures for replacement. It had tables of organization. It had training schedules at Fort Benning. What it did not have was any way to measure the invisible cost carried by the men who stayed alive long enough to become competent. And that cost was enormous. Some of them came home and never found language for it. They did not talk, not because there was nothing to say, but because there was too much. Because the people waiting for them had no framework for what they were hearing. Because the men who could have understood were often gone. Buried in France. Buried in Belgium. Buried in places whose names remained fixed in memory long after the war had ended. So when people remember the 90-day wonders, they often remember the nickname first. It sounds dismissive, almost ironic, but the reality behind it was far darker. These were not simply inexperienced young officers moving through a shortened training course at Fort Benning, Georgia. These were men pushed through a 13-week pipeline because the Army needed platoon leaders at a rate that only catastrophe could explain. Men sent into rifle platoons that had already been broken and rebuilt by combat. Men placed in the most exposed place in the battlefield, not by accident, but by doctrine. And that is the part history can flatten if you let it. The statistics are there. More than 100,000 candidates enrolled in infantry officer candidate school between July 1941 and the end of the war. Roughly 2/3 completed the course. Rifle companies of roughly 5,200 men in divisions of more than 14,000 absorbed a staggering share of the fighting. Nearly 90% of all American casualties in the theater were infantrymen. Some rifle companies lost nearly 60% of their enlisted men and more than 68% of their officers between June 6th and July 31st, 1944. An average infantry regiment in 3 months of combat could sustain 100% casualties, killed, wounded, or missing. Those are the numbers. But the men inside those numbers were something else entirely. At the front of each platoon was a lieutenant with gold bars on his collar and far too little time behind him. He had rank, but not yet wisdom, authority, but not yet trust. A map, a carbine, a platoon sergeant who knew more than he did, and a battlefield that punished hesitation as quickly as overconfidence. He had to learn under fire, and he had to learn fast, because the enemy was teaching the course now. That was the real education of the rifle platoon leader in the ETO. Not the 13 weeks in Georgia, but the weeks that followed in Normandy, in the Hurtgen Forest, along the Siegfried Line, in the Ardennes, and across every patch of ground where American infantry had to close with the German army and destroy it at short range. The curriculum was fear. The examination was combat. And the penalty for failing it was often immediate. The ones who survived did not come home the same men who had left Fort Benning. They could not. Too much had been laid on them too fast. Too much had been seen. Too much had been decided in seconds and remembered for years. The gold bars stayed the same, but underneath them was something heavier, older, harder, something built under pressure in the worst classroom imaginable. That is what it meant to be a rifle platoon leader in the ETO in 1944. Young, exposed, burdened, necessary. A man trained just enough to begin the job, then forced to finish learning it where the fire was thickest and the margin for error almost gone. The army needed him forward. The platoon needed him forward. The battle would not move unless he moved first. And so he did. If this is the kind of history you value, the human weight beneath the rank, the men hidden inside the statistics, leave a comment, give the piece a like, and subscribe in your own way.